a disregard for other fields of study, a total love for machines and how cool they are, and look at the cool things. No reckoning in this paper in any way about what would it mean if we would have machines that could think. Hello, this is Felienne.
And this is Hanna.
And this is another episode of Computer Science, of course.
Computer science.
Of course. Computer science.
Of course.
This is Computer Science.
Of course.
Of course.
Felienne, another episode, another paper. What did you bring for us this time?
So now it can be debated whether this is computer science, of course, because what I want to talk about is Computer Machinery and Intelligence by Alan Turing, which is maybe more popularly known as the paper in which the Turing Test was first introduced. So you can very well argue that this is computer science. I will try to argue today, for various reasons, this is not computer science and therefore counts as of course.
Perfect. Maybe give us a little bit of background about this paper. I mean, probably our listeners have heard of Alan Turing, but remind us, what year is this paper from? Where was it published? How long is it?
How long is it? That's the easiest question, I think. About 25 pages. It was published in 1950, so a little bit after the World War, in which Turing, of course, participated, helping win the war by cracking codes of the Germans. And it appeared in a journal called Mind, on things related to the mind, I guess. So not necessarily in a computer science venue, although, of course, in 1950, there was not really computer science. There was math. He is a mathematician, but there were also many other people from other fields participating in research around computers, like Herbert Simon, for example, who won a Turing Award later, but also a Nobel Prize for economy. So you can see that this field of computer science that's emerging initially was quite broad and multidisciplinary.
25 pages, you say. Is it a good paper?
No.
Oh. Why not?
I hate to bring it to you. So parts of it are good, I think, to be fair. So as a paper, it's trying to do many things. Let's maybe just read the first sentence, because that scopes out what the paper is about really nicely, insofar that the title doesn't do this. So the paper starts like this. Imitation game. I propose to consider the question, can machines think? So that is what the paper is about. Can machines think? And then a big part of the paper is where he explains what machines are, how computers work, which is somewhat interesting, specifically then in those days. And he also hypothesizes a bit about the idea of machine learning, that a machine could learn as a child learns by feeding it data. So then you're like, wow, right? This is prescient of you to think of this. But then a bigger part of the paper is about, he says, sort of argues that machines can think. And then a lot of the paper is, well, but here's a counter argument. And then he picks apart these counter arguments. So it's sort of a fake debate between him and people that will disagree with him. And both the part in which he explains the imitation game, what its goals are, but also the part in which he battles the opposing ideas. Not so strong.
There, tell us a bit more about this imitation game you mentioned, and maybe about things that struck you about his arguments.
Yeah, so one part that I don't want to go into too deeply, because it's not my core sort of attack of the paper, but the way he introduces the imitation game already on the first page is there is an interrogator. And this is the person that has to figure out, am I chatting with a person, a human flesh and blood person, or with a computer? But the way he initially introduces it is not between an interrogator on the one hand side and then a room with a person or a computer. No, he starts with this imitation game by explaining that you have to choose as interrogator between a man and a woman.
Okay, and why?
I don't know. And then he sets up this whole game like, imagine you have to pick whether you are chatting with a man or a woman. How would you do this? And then he has this Okay, I said I don't want to go into it so long, but yeah, it is interesting. Let me bring up the quote where he talks about how we would do this, right? So
And
how would you pick between a man and a woman? For example, you could ask, can you tell me the length of your hair?
oh my
And then
God.
an hypothesized woman or man playing a woman would say, my hair is shingled and the longest strands are about 9 inches long. And this
Oh,
is
wow.
page 1.
And
And then he says, I don't understand why he doesn't just introduce the game as the game is. Then at one point he says, well, what happens when a machine takes the part of one of these two players? So that's just a very weird way of introducing it. And if you really read it closely, it's also confusing because then should the computer play a woman or should it play a person? But
and
as I said, I don't want to go into this weirdness because it's sort of funny. Like, why would you do it like this? But it's not a real deep criticism of ideas in the paper. I think there's much more interesting stuff. But it is weird that, and this is also maybe what it makes it, of course, this is page 1. And I think it's very clear if you hear people talk about this, no one read this paper. I was doing a guest lecture here at VU in a course, and then I talked about this a little bit. And one student that was in an AI program came to me and was like, "Why didn't no one tell me this in my AI program?" I'm like, I don't know, right? But I never read this paper. Did you read this paper when you were studying computer science?
yeah, actually, we were asked to read it in the media technology
Cool.
program, but I think this is a quite special program. It's not a computer science.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
But
I
we
think
read it. And
yes.
I
Ooh,
have
and do you remember, like, what are your memories from reading it?
I just remember it was a very weird paper.
Yeah, so I never read it, and indeed Mediatek is a bit of a sort of special program, and I don't think many people read it, which is really weird if you look at the cultural role that the Turing test has. Even now, a few months ago, a paper came out in Nature saying, oh, we finally beat the Turing test. Okay, but then you have to situate yourself against what the Turing test is and what its goals are also. So here, can we talk about the goals a bit? This is also still on page 1, and I think this is more interesting because there is, in my book, a direct line from this line in the paper to the AI situation that we're in currently. Because what Turing says, the goal of the computer or the person or the woman, it is the object in the game to try and cause the interrogator to make the wrong identification. And
Okay.
I think this is interesting. So core here to the Turing test idea, we have the notion that the computer must try to fool the interrogator. So we have to design AI, he says, sorta, right? In such a way that it exactly looks and behaves like a person, such that we will be confused. And then I'm like, yeah, that's a human computer interaction decision, man.
Yeah.
What are the implications of making a computer that pretends to be a person? And I think if you look at ChatGPT or Claude or whatever in these days, you see this design there that it says, oh, I am sorry. It is trying to fool you into
Yeah.
thinking it is a person. And it doesn't have to be like that. We could also have, even if we want language models with all the different problems that language models might have, we might have language models that say, oh, you want information about the moon? This is what is on the internet, right? Not this is what I found on the internet. This is a summary of the internet, colon, and then the information. And I think part of the problems of AI would then not be there. People wouldn't think, oh, it has a consciousness, or maybe wouldn't get addicted to chatting with it. So I found this to be much more interesting than the weird gender stuff, because this is really deciding on what a computer should look like. And maybe he's only saying, well, computers can only think if they pretend to be people. Only then would it look like they're thinking. That's, I think, one interesting part of this paper that we are constantly running up against in the actual real world now.
Yes, I definitely would prefer ChatGPT to talk like a machine and not like a human. And in so many other domains, we got it. I mean, we don't build airplanes that fly like humans would fly,
Yeah.
because then they wouldn't fly.
Yes.
So why would we imitate humans in this field where probably another way would just be much more authentic? Um, okay, that is a big point that links it closely to our current AI situation. Um,
And I
what?
actually like, if I can go back to your
Yeah.
comment, I was browsing to go back to it quickly, but I wasn't succeeding. But now I have, because you're talking about an airplane. He does this as well. So he scopes out this argument where, well, an airplane goes really quickly. So he says, we do not wish to penalize the machine for its inability to shine in a beauty contest, nor to penalize a man for losing in a race against an aeroplane. So he's already saying, hey, there's something people cannot do, go as quickly as an aeroplane. And there's also some things that machines will never be able to do, shine in a beauty contest. Nah, I think we are actually here in the timeline where we do have machines that could shine in a beauty contest. But let's put that aside. This second part I think is interesting. So he just poses, well, people cannot go as quickly as airplanes, so we don't need to do this. I'm like, okay, but then maybe we can also say machines cannot think like people, nor can they shine in beauty competitions. But then he doesn't go into this. This is just like, oh, no, we cannot do this because we can't. The conditions of our game make these disabilities irrelevant. Okay, yeah,
Okay.
I see what you're saying there, but I would say not just irrelevant, but then also this. You could have some reflection on your game that, yeah, these are things. Basically, the embodiment of people isn't in there.
What is this understanding of thinking? I'm a bit confused.
Yes, so this is another part of the paper that is absolutely interesting. So he
Yeah.
is a mathematician, but he was in Cambridge. He first as a student and then later as a fellow. He has a PhD from Princeton. He was in Cambridge at the time that Wittgenstein was also in Cambridge. And we know from historical records that he attended lectures from Wittgenstein and hung out with him a bit. So he does have some exposure, I would say, to the outside world. If he would want to consider this question, can machines think? He could do this in a philosophical, not sort of fair way. But he doesn't do this. He says, after this first sentence, we should begin with the definitions of the meanings of the terms machine and think. I'm like, yes,
Yeah.
okay, let's try to do this. But then he say, well, these definitions might reflect what normal people think. This is very weird because now I'm free forming a little bit. Can machines think? We cannot find this answer in a statistical survey such as a Gallup poll. And this is a survey among people. We cannot just ask people what these words mean. I'm like, no, but maybe you could ask philosophers. This is absurd. Now I'm literally quoting again. This is absurd. Instead of attempting such a definition, I will just replace this question with another. That is the Turing test, which is closely related and expressed in relatively unambiguous words. And this is the first paragraph. So he does not engage with this question of can machines think in any way. He just says, well, I replace this question with a different question. And you see that also if you look at the citation list, he cites the Bible a bunch of times for actually okay reasons.
Okay.
And then one medical doctor who was
Mhm.
actually arguing that people are not like robots. And the rest of the citations are mathematicians.
No, Wittgenstein.
No Wittgenstein, which is, I would say, wicked, because if you know a bit about Wittgenstein, maybe we will do a future episode on Wittgenstein. I would love this very much. But one thing that Wittgenstein is known for is something called seeing language as a language game. And then he says, like, language is like a game because you sort of play a sentence, and then the other person replies with a sentence. So he says language, you can see this as a game, a spiel. And spiel is slightly different from game, but we will set that aside. So he even uses game, right? And he is known to hang out with a philosopher of language. And then he makes a game about language. I mean, this is even, you could even see this as one big fucking subtweet of Wittgenstein's. Like, I don't care what you say. I'll make my own game with my unambiguous rules. So this is this sort of my second line, I think, of the problems of this paper towards the problems of modern day computer science. How can you think that you, a mathematician, can just write a paper on thinking and have it accepted in a journal? Well, this is what you get. And just not engage with what is thinking. And there's thousands of years of philosophy from different backgrounds on what is thinking. And he just openly ignores all of this in the first paragraphs and says, I don't care. The only way he can think that you can come to a definition is apparently do a survey. That's the only way you can get to a definition.
And that's absurd.
And that's absurd. So then we just cannot do this, and then we just do something that is unambiguous. Right? This is also so computer science in 2026. There's this piece in New York Times, we can link to it, from last year, in which a computer science professor, I think from Harvard or maybe Stanford, like one of the Ivies, argues. He says, in literal words, I teach my students programming such that they will discover there is an absolute truth. So again, I think just not engaging with other fields, but still thinking you can just write about those other fields, and also thinking everything in the world can be expressed in unambiguous terms. I don't want to say all Turing's fault, right? He did it.
Oh.
This smoking gun, and otherwise we would have a different computer science. But of course, it is both participating in, but also spreading the way that we think still about computer science as this mathematical, unambiguous thing, rather than we are modeling the messiness of people that cannot be expressed in unambiguous words.
What damage has been done with this paper, aside from the things you already mentioned?
So I do think that the Turing test is a thought experiment, right? He doesn't present it as something very different, although he says in 50 years, people will be doing this incorrectly in 70% of the time after 5 minutes. So again, super mathematician. But so it is like a thought experiment. However, it turned into a goal that people building AI, sort of when chess and Go were conquered by AI, and it's like, oh, now maybe we have the technology with neural nets and with really big data sets and a lot of compute. Maybe now we can win the Turing test. So, and of course he couldn't really have predicted this, although maybe he could. It turned into a goal, and then you go to this deception again, that people wanted to write algorithms that could pass the Turing test. And that is also, of course, a big legacy.
And aside from intelligence and thinking and computers or machines, are there other key terms or concepts in this paper that are maybe worth discussing?
Yeah, so one other thing is maybe interesting, and this is a bit more subtle, right? For the other places, I can just point to a sentence where he says the exact thing. So he says that in communicating between the interrogator and the thing we're observing, you should only communicate with written paper, and you shouldn't do like intonation, because then this would be unfair to the machine, because it cannot do intonation and it cannot like wave his hands as I always do when I speak. Which you could make many arguments against. But I think the interesting thing is that he poses, without arguing for it, that just by observation, you can decide if someone is thinking. And there also you could say, well, this cannot be observed with input and output only. How do I know you are thinking? Yes. I don't know this. How do I know you are not a robot? I cannot know this. But in human communication, in just human relationships, we assume things, right? And we do not really need proof for this. not only am I assuming that you are thinking, I'm only also assuming you are my friend.
Yep.
You don't say to me, I am your friend if you're over the age of 7, I think. But I'm assuming we are friends because, well, some observations I make that if we go somewhere, it looks like you're having a good time. But also, I just trust this, right? You cannot prove to me that we are friends by giving the right answer to a question. And this is true for, like, how do I know my husband loves me? I cannot put a thermometer in his ear and say, oh, he loves me a lot. No, you have to trust that the other person is your friend and your spouse that loves you and is thinking. So it's almost an offensive notion that conversation can be observed from the outside only and doesn't just require a level of trust and also a level of uncertainty. Because I'm happily assuming you, Hannah, can think, but then I have a pet turtle. Can my turtle think? And then can a plant think? I read this fantastic book. It's called Light Eaters, about what plants can do. Plants can do many things, man. So they can just like put their little leaves in the direction of the sun. Is that thinking? Maybe. So it cannot just by output alone, I think, be decided. It requires trust, but also it requires definitions. And then, in a funny side note, he does give a super duper extensive explanation of what a machine is that takes like a few pages of what is a computer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-ish pages on what is a machine. Okay, so what is a machine can be defined. That is also not, of course, an easy question. What exactly is a machine? But that can be defined, and the other things, this is absurd. So that subtle thing, again, if we would all agree that it cannot be decided that computers can think, which I think it cannot be decided, I think it's a matter of faith, then also we have to say whatever new model we have has AGI. Because if you just decide this is impossible, then you can still build language models and they might still have a use, but then we're not talking about artificial general intelligence and that computers can really think.
Yes. Oh, this is very. Somehow this makes me emotional.
I get that.
Yeah. Whew.
This is how I know you're not a robot.
Yes. Real tears on the inside, not on the outside.
There's this, okay, so let's go to a little bit later part of the paper. That's also wicked, unhinged, where he says, okay, here are a number of objections, right? So this is my idea. You may disagree with me. And he has very reasonable names for the disagreements. For example, he has the hands in the sand objection. That's just, people don't want this. That's their objection, is that they don't like this. They don't want this to exist. And another one of the objections, this is where the Bible comes in. He says the theological objection. Some people might say that thinking is a function of man's immortal soul. I actually believe that this is true. I'm not sure if I say it's an immortal soul, but soul definitely. I believe people have a thing that makes them people. And then he says, well, very long story, that Christians might find this a problem. Then, if Christians might find this a problem, literal quote, how do Christians regard the Muslim view that women have no souls?
Wait, what?
Wait, what? Do you want me to do it again?
No, I'm just.
And then I wrote here as a little aside in the first round of reading, is that a thing?
Yeah.
I don't think Muslims think this. I have Muslim friends. I don't think they think I have no soul. or that their female friends have no soul. But I don't know, right? Maybe there's wicked stuff in the Bible also, that you shouldn't wear clothes that's made of different materials or anything. So I'm like, let's Google if this is a thing. And then if you Google this, then you will find Reddit posts on this paper, on the Turing Test paper, that say, hey, is this a thing? And people are like, no, of course not, right? Of course not. And here again, we can say, ha 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 ha, so funny. But we can also say, how could he think this? Did he not know any Muslim people? Did he not know in Cambridge or Princeton any scholars of religion that he could send a letter to, or just walk to their office and say, hey, quick question. Do you think women have souls? And what does Muslim scripture say about this? And I'm also thinking, I don't know what peer review was like in the 1950s. You would think it would be better because they get less papers, so they have a lot of attention and time to devote to things. But the fact that this is there and that it remains there shows just a disinterest in people and being correct.
How many objections are there?
1, 2, 3 is in my version. There's number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9. We should definitely go to objection 9. We should not skip objection 9. And there are many others interesting ones. There's this theological. There's this one about consciousness, where they just say, well, maybe a machine can think, but what is consciousness? What does this mean? He also has one of the objections specifically devoted to battling Ada Lovelace. Ada Lovelace had already thought about this before Alan Turing thought about this. And she just basically says, nah, it's not possible. She has this lovely quote that Ada Lovelace says that the analytical engine, that is the computer that she's talking about, has no pretensions to originate anything. It doesn't make things. It just does what you tell it to do. And that's, I think, true for language modelers as well. They never call you with a question. I hope we don't get the future in which they do, but for now they don't, right? They can only reply, which I think is a beautiful and also very prescient notion of her. And she says this way earlier in 1842. So yeah, right, this is a good objection. And then he says, no, this is crazy. Here he does another sort of bait and switch. So he says, a variant of Lady Lovelace's objection states that a machine can never do anything really new. So he just takes her argument and he says, this is a variant of the argument, which I think already loses a lot, because originating something and doing something new isn't really true. And then he says, well, but sometimes computers take me by surprise. So that is something new. Here I wrote down, well, Turing, sometimes a book takes me by surprise. I read a book and I'm like, wow, I didn't know this thing. Is now this book thinking? No, right? Sometimes I could go even further. Sometimes I'm in nature and then I see a flower in an unexpected place. Sometimes you see a flower like in between two street tiles. And like, wow, nature finds a way. I'm like, I am surprised by this little flower. Is the flower now thinking? So it just takes this objection, changes it into something else, and then even the something else is still argued against in a very bad way.
Do you think he was aware that he's basically using tricks and not really arguing in a very logically valid way? I mean,
Yes.
how can a person so intelligent do this without being aware? I would assume he's like, oh, there's this counter argument and I don't have a good argument against it, so I'll just change it slightly. And
So there also, I think, is maybe the final point I want to make that is of substance before we do objection 9, just for the lols. There is in society, there was then and there is now a sort of hierarchy of knowledge. Mathematical knowledge, or knowledge from physics or natural sciences, is seen as very valuable. These are difficult fields in which smart people participate. And then there's the lowly stuff. There's the social sciences and the humanities that clearly are not rational, right? They're very easy. They don't require arguments. They don't build machines. They don't collect data. And this hierarchy is I think very strong. You see this also in just funding of research. A lot of it goes to the natural sciences because they are doing useful things. They are building inventions and computer stuff. And then the social sciences and specifically the humanities, they just sit there and read books. They are not contributing to the world. From this perspective, I think you could think as a mathematician that you can just do philosophy because philosophy is easy. It doesn't require math. Of course you can do this because you are socially constructed and maybe also starting to see yourself as very, very smart. And I think you see this also in the fact that Richard Dawkins, a biologist who is somewhat higher maybe on the spectrum in the natural sciences, thinks he could just write a book on religion. Right? I was just reading this book in preparation for other work I'm doing. The book is called The God Delusion, in which a biologist is arguing that, basically theology is stupid and religion is stupid, and why would we ever do these things? Not really in a similar way to Turing, not at all engaging with the field or even talking to people from the field. So I think that is maybe a long answer to your question. How could a smart person do this? Because they think they are so smart and their field and their qualification make them so smart that they're smarter than people from other fields that are socially constructed as more lowly, easy fields. That's my best answer. Or maybe he was just himself individually not as smart as he thought. But I think there's a social dynamic there too.
And that is a social dynamic that is still in place, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And that's also a reason, I think, why computer science people don't read papers, this one and other ones, because what they're focused on is doing hard stuff, which is proofs and algorithms and programming. Reading a paper. Everyone can read a paper. This is not hard, right? That's not what we're here to do if we come to study computer science. And also, what would they do with the paper? Sometimes I think, yeah, people should read this paper. But then I also think, but many computer science graduates wouldn't have the knowledge to read the paper such that they would get something out of it, right? In order to see, like, why isn't he citing Wittgenstein? You have to know Wittgenstein. And in order to know that he is very offensive to human computers, you have to know that in those days and age, they were usually women. So there's so much knowledge that you need, an interest in history and philosophy that makes reading the paper fun, in air quotes, and valuable. If you don't have that knowledge and you might be reading it and you're like, yeah, those counter arguments actually are reasonable.
Oh, but then what do we change about the computer science curriculum? Now, you already said we need philosophy, we need history. What else do we need? And
yeah, so I think this podcast is our attempt to do that a little bit, right? To put something that's, of course, maybe ultimately in course. I don't know. I am also a computer scientist and a product of current computer science education. So I know some random things, and I try to take all these random things and bring them into the view of computer science people with my book and with this podcast. That's what I'm trying to do. But there's so many things out there, I'm sure. Maybe at one point we have a big audience for this podcast and they will send us other stuff and then we will know more. But I'm like, I don't know well enough what's there because I only learned what I learned, which is programming databases and algorithms. Let's go to objection 9.
yes.
I want to do it. I'm like spitting my hands. Let's do it. Okay. So this is first funny, and then also I have some serious things to say about it. So here we go. The argument from extrasensory perception. I assume the reader is familiar of the idea of extrasensory perception, such as telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis. These disturbing phenomena seem to deny all our usual scientific ideas. How we should like to discredit them? Unfortunately, the statistical evidence, at least for telepathy, is overwhelming.
Okay. So yeah, my first reaction is laughing, but
I wrote lol what in the margin. This was page, I don't know, this was page 20. At this point, I was like, please stop, I cannot. But here's my more serious reflection, for which it doesn't matter if we believe or people believe that telepathy then was a thing. What conclusion does he draw from this? I would say, if you're being honest, if you do believe telepathy is real, you are done with your Turing test. Because then, as a person, you can just do with your telepathy brain, just ring the other person like, ding, ding, hey, are you a person? And then the telepathy enabled person can just say, yup, flesh and blood here. And a computer will not be able to do this, right? Then you are done with your test. But then he does not do this. He says, literal quote again, if telepathy is admitted, it will be necessary to tighten our test up. I circled tighten up and I said, not even reject at this point, huh? He says, no. We simply have to put the competitors into a telepathy-proof room. And that would satisfy the requirements. So here I think you can just see that he is so committed to this idea that now we put a lead plate in between you and the computer, and then you will not know. But then what is the point, right? The point of the test is to know that if people are doing a special people-y thing. That's what he wants to know. And then here's this special people-y thing that people could do. It's like, no, this also is out of the question, just as looking beautiful is out of the question.
We could also forbid people to be intelligent. Then it's easier for the computer.
Okay, I'll do one more quote. I promise. This is just funny. I will first do it in my response in Dutch because it just sounds more natural, and then I will try to translate it because I made Dutch annotations. Final section. The reader will have anticipated that I have no very convincing arguments of a positive nature to support my views. So all of the arguments are like, this is a counter argument, and here's my counter to the counter. I have no very convincing arguments. I wrote down, ja, dat was me opgevallen hoor. Which translates to something like, yeah, I noticed. But in Dutch, you can use little words like hoor, which don't really have a meaning and they just stress a feeling. So yeah, I did notice you do not really have any positive argument. You do not explain in any way why you believe this. The only thing you're saying is, here's an objection and here's my objection to the objection. But then he says, such evidence I will now give. Okay. So you're now giving positive arguments. Such arguments I will now give. Here in my version is a page break. So I am eagerly anticipating the next sentence. And then what is the next sentence? Let us return to Lady Lovelace's objection. No, wait, stop. You were going to do positive arguments. And now here again, and then again, he is counter-arguing the counter-arguments. Yeah, and then many stuff follows. I think by now there's some ableism relating to what blind people can do. I give up. I am done. I cannot anymore.
No.
This is the paper. Do you have any questions?
My question is, how was this paper received? Did people cite it immediately? Did they respond to it? Did they come up with more objections in their papers, or was this hidden and only discovered later on?
No, actually, there are quite good objections. One of them is by Peter Nauer, our friend from before. And also, even that's a little bit later, I think somewhere in the 80s, but even in those more recent more close to the paper itself in the 50s. People were responding to this. Philosophers were responding to this.
Okay. And then I was thinking maybe a logical next paper for us to read does follow from this, or maybe a book. Maybe What Computers Can't Do would be a good follow-up on this.
Yes, I would very much like to do what computers can do for the next episode. It is sort of a takedown of this to a certain extent. But so one version of this is from the 70s, and then there's a version from the 90s, what computers still can't do. Um, it's not directly attacking, I think, the Turing test. It's more attacking the research that was then actively being done at MIT, for example, to get actual artificial intelligence out there. And then it's making some argument about embodiments. But we can definitely do that as the next one.
Excellent. And then, of course, the weekly homework. I'm looking forward.
So I think for this paper, my homework would not be pleasant, but I will do it nonetheless. I think people should read this paper from the top to the bottom, because it needs to be sort of read to be believed. I do think taking it in entirely, sort of breaks your, it breaks you a little bit as a computer scientist, right? Then you heard so many people being like, oh, Turing, oh, so good. And he helped us win the war. And he's so smart. And also, of course, I want to point out his life was very tragic. And I did another podcast. I was a guest on another podcast that's run. And one of the hosts of that podcast is a queer person. And then they were also like, but we have so few queer icons in computer science, right? I don't want this paper to be bad. I don't want to trash talk Turing, because he was a gay man in so troubling times and he paid the price for that. I don't want this to be bad. And I want to acknowledge and appreciate that sentiment that I understand and share to a certain extent. But this is our field. And this was our field then, before it existed. And this is our field now. A disregard for other fields of study. A total love for machines and how cool they are. And look at the cool things. No reckoning in this paper in any way about what would it mean if we would have machines that could think. And this head in the sand argument that says, well, we don't want this future. Why do those people, including me now, don't want this future in which machines can think? Not at all thinking about the societal impact, because we just want to build the cool machines, right? If you have to summarize what I think his vibe is, satire or not, is we want to build very cool machines, and what would make it look like they can actually do thinking, so that we can build very cool machines that look like they're thinking. That has always been our field. That's how it came to be. I don't like that version of computer science, but that's the version we got. So sad homework. And maybe if you want to do a bit of extra points for, reaching the A grade, you can, I think, read this paper and then directly connect it to stuff in the news or recent papers. It's like, oh, hey, this dynamic that I see here, oh, it still exists. Look, here's a paper. So if you want to do that form of annotation, I think that's useful, where you're like, oh, hey, some of these arguments are now being actively fought on social media that are in the Turing Test paper as well. This was fun. See you next time.
Yeah, see you next time. Hi Felienne, it's Hanna with the homework. I read the paper, it wasn't pleasant, it wasn't fun, but yes, actually this time I did do my homework. I have to admit I'm a bit scared of talking about this paper because I don't want to repeat Alan Turing's mistakes of saying all these things without engaging with other disciplines enough. But okay, I'll just give you my raw thoughts. Let's start with the biggest concern I have with this paper. So this paper builds on the assumption that imitating intelligent behavior is essentially the same as truly intelligent behavior when the two can no longer be distinguished. But let's just for a second try out this line of reasoning with emotions rather than intelligence. Let's say there's Alice. Alice really loves Bob. Alice is also very rich. And then there's Bob, and Bob does not love Alice, but Bob really wants her money. So Bob pretends to love Alice really, really well. He pretends to love her so well that Alice does not notice a difference. Alice truly believes Bob loves her, and they spend a wonderful life together. Alice is happy, and then she dies, and then Bob gets all her money, and then Bob is happy. And now let's ask ourselves, does it matter that Bob did not love Alice? That he was just pretending? And I think this matters so much. It's so wrong. It's unethical. It should never have happened. And for me, the same is true about intelligence. It matters whether it's true intelligence or if it's just pretending. And I believe Bob in this scenario is big tech and all the AI companies. And they are just in it for the money. They are pretending for the money. And I don't know whether their machines can think, but the chance they are faking it for the money is really big, just like Bob was faking it for the money in this Alice story. And I think, of course, there are many smart people who say, I know it's all fake thinking. I know it's not real intelligence. I double check all the answers. I check for hallucinations. I know they are just after my money, but I get enough out of it, so I'm still using it. And I think that's maybe fine. It's a bit like Alice is aware that Bob is faking it, and she decides to stay in the relationship nonetheless for the great sex. And that's Alice's choice to make, of course. I'm not here to tell anyone not to use AI, but just keep in mind that machines, they may or may not be able to think, but they definitely are able to manipulate. There's no doubt about that. And then just like it's really unethical for Bob to pretend to love Alice, I think it's unethical for machines to pretend to be humans. And while I think Alice has a good right to stay in this relationship for the sex, she should not call this love. And just like that, we should not call this machine behavior intelligence. One related detail that struck me is a small prediction that Turing made around how we use words and language around thinking. So he writes, I believe at the end of the century, the use of words and general educated opinion will have altered so much that one will be able to speak of machines thinking without expecting to be contradicted. And I have a little anecdote about that. So my partner came home from work rather angry because of something that another colleague had said on Slack. So someone had Googled something, and then the reaction on Slack was, did you enable thinking? And he came home and he was like, did you enable thinking? Did you enable thinking? And let that sink in. So now we talk about machines in terms of thinking. And of course, at that time, Gemini had introduced this new AI feature that they call thinking, and you can enable thinking. And others had introduced reasoning or extended thinking or a thinking flag you can give with your prompt. So this has been really becoming a thing, and people have started using language like this. And of course, yes, some of us are still here to contradict it or to complain when people do this, but talking about machines thinking is indeed getting a thing. So yes, Turing kind of was right here. Another detail I found fascinating is how little Turing cares about machines looking like humans. So he says that engineers probably can't make material that looks like skin, and then he says, it is possible that at some time this might be done, but even supposing this invention available, we should feel there was little point in trying to make a thinking machine more human by dressing it up in such artificial flesh. So this is interesting because we as a field, and especially the field of robotics, has been doing this. We have been dressing up machines in artificial flesh, even though Alan Turing said there's no point in trying to make this artificial flesh. One example I want to point at listeners to is the work by Hiroshi Ichiguro. He's a Japanese roboticist, and he has been creating these clones of himself that really look like him. And he has been using them to explore questions around remote presence. And these look really uncanny. It's really, really interesting to look at. Then I also have a bit of a thought experiment for you. So one thing I really liked about Turing's paper is this thought experiment vibe. But then I was thinking, okay, let's go along with this and accept his premise that there is indeed this weird party game where you have an interrogator and he's talking to a man and he's talking to a woman, and the interrogator tries to find out who is who, but the man is trying to imitate the woman. And then, like Turing, let's say we want to replace one of these people with a machine. So far, so bad, but okay, let's go along with this for a second. Then I just wonder, why would you replace the man in this scenario? Why would you not replace the interrogator? So to me, it seems like the interrogator here has to be smart. They have to ask good questions. They have to draw the correct conclusions. They have to do the things we associate with being intelligent. So why not replace the interrogator? I really wonder if this occurred to Alan Turing to replace the interrogator instead, and what would have happened to his paper if he had replaced the interrogator? What would have happened to the field of computer science if he had replaced the interrogator? And then I think if we look at how machines are used currently in the real world, they often take this role of the interrogator, or at least of something that has to decide, is it A or is it B? Is it true or is it false? Is it cancer or is it harmless? Is it a good hire or is it not a good hire? Is this a true fact or is this a misleading misinformation? So metaphorically speaking, I think by now machines have replaced the other player, the man in the game. They also have replaced the interrogator in the game. And then for me, the question is, why are we still playing this game as humans? To whose benefit are we playing this game? And I think we are playing this game for the amusement of the tech pros, and we are basically the jokes at their parties. Yeah. And maybe a more fundamental problem I have with this paper is its view of thinking. So for me personally, thinking can only be intelligent if these thoughts are authentic, autonomous thoughts. And this is also how we, of course, evaluate PhD candidates. We want to see, are they autonomous researchers? We look at their thesis and look if it contains their thoughts. So what I mean here is simply put that for something or someone to be intelligent, these smart thoughts they express also need to be their thoughts. And they need to be authentic and the result of some autonomous thought process. And this is where it goes wrong for me in the paper, which is very much focused on the output needs to be smart. And it's also where it goes wrong for me when we look at current LLMs. So this output might appear to be intelligent, but whether it's authentic and the result of an autonomous thought process is a completely different question. And I actually asked an LLM and it said, no, large language models output is not inherently authentic. And no, LLM output is not the result of autonomous thought. So no surprise here. So I think we can do this little trick that Turing also does, where it just replaces one question with a slightly different question. So I think instead of asking, can machines think? A better question to ask is the machine output authentic? And in this case, I agree with the machines. No, it's not. And then maybe for the end, another final question. Can we still celebrate Alan Turing? I really hate that this paper is bad, and I think we can forgive him for this. And actually, I think we forgive LLMs all the time for saying really stupid things. The amount of bullshit we accept from LLMs is crazy. And if we accept this from machines, I think we can also accept some stupid thoughts from a human. I think we should be more lenient with humans than with machines. And I think we can also be forgiving with Alan Turing. He did a lot of super weird things in this paper, things I don't endorse at all, but he was human, and I think he did much better than any machine could have done at that time. Speaking of time, I think it's time to end the episode. Hope you tune in next time. Bye!